Okay, so this second recording is going to be looking specifically at physical and symbolic borders and bordering practices. So it leads on from the everyday, and we'll be exploring this in a number of different contexts. So the first pause I'd like to do here is think about borders. Where are borders? What do they look like? Who borders? How are borders demarcated? How would we interact with borders in the everyday? Is this an even process? Is it experienced in an even way? And I'd like to write down your thoughts in relation to some of the reading that you've done already. The first point to make here is that this idea of bordering and ordering, that borders are actually about ordering of chaos. And if we shift from this idea of the border as a tangible noun, so something visible that's mapped out on territory, a wall, a window, a door, a line in the sand, a checkpoint we pass through, and we think about it more as a noun, from a noun to an active verb. And what this does is it reminds us that the making of borders, bordering, is a relationship process. It's something that is being done unto others. And it also helps us understand this in terms of its fluidity, something that is movable, something that is variable, something that is shifting. So it's not so much an object or material artifact, it becomes a belief that then creates and shapes a social reality. And in this sense, borders that are physical traditionally exist alongside everyday bordering practices, which create new types of divisions that are spatial and also symbolic in nature. And in many respects, we can think about borders as being including and excluding. All borders are a form of social construction, and they are delimited and demarcated by people. But there are specific benchmarks that we would use as a cut-off point. So geographic regions have mountains and rivers and deserts. Municipals and cities have rail lines and public buildings. And society has groups, age, race, gender, religions, economic status, and immigration status. And critically engaging with the idea of bordering challenges the idea of the essence of borders, not just to be taken for granted mappability, or on the grounds of their common sense visibility, but they also can, by being critical, helps us understand how the world comes to be prioritised. But borders increasingly symbolic, but still remain very much something physical. And we see here that in October of this year, that Trump's big, beautiful border wall prototypes have now just been announced. And I'll make this clip available on Moodle so you can listen to the clip as well. But we can see that while we have the symbolic borders, we also have very much the increasing physical presence of borders. And so when we're thinking about bordering, we think about this tension between the physical and the intangible, the real and the symbolic. And of course, not everyone experiences or sees borders in the same way. For some, it can be something they pass through. For others, it can be something that excludes. Zygmunt Bauman talks about living in liquid times, that we live in deterritorialized times. But in contrary to this, we could argue that borders and order has increased, and they are nonetheless ambiguous. But for some people, they run up against them continuously. Okay, they're not a one-off. There's a systematic bordering process in place. Chris Rumford describes borders as a firewall. They perform a form of intelligent filtering. They're designed to allow the passage of some who are seen as desirable while keeping undesirables out. And what's interesting here is what Yuval Davis talks about, the vernacularization, the movement from the margin to the centre, from the extraordinary to the everyday lives, has become very much a central aspect of immigration regimes, actually across the West. And she argues, and when you watch the film Everyday Borders, you'll see this, that this is threatening to destroy the conviviality of multicultural Britain in general, conviviality in the sense of people of difference rubbing along, getting by. But we see this happening in supermarkets, in housing, in schools, in hospitals, in banks, and in all the different forms of so-called tourism, health, education, benefits, school, that we're seeing increasingly discussed in public and media debates. But what happens when it enters into the vernacular and into the everyday is that people are also conscripted as border guards in bordering activities in education and health and social work and employment and housing on behalf of the state. So we become those everyday border guards. And legislation increasingly demands that of us. And what we see is this legislation affecting those who wear the passports on their faces, as Sivanandan says. In this important article, where he talks about racism, liberty, and the war on terror, and who becomes the targets of this war on terror. It's not just the wearing of passports, though, as we've seen increasingly, but it's also in the names we bear and the accents in which we speak. There was the case very recently of Emma Svejciak-Harris, a British woman who married a Polish man and took his name and integrated it into her name, and on the basis of her name was being denied maternity care. So we have this bordering taking place in everyday contexts. And this emerges from a wider concern of securitisation, right? That arises from a politics of everyday fear, that states cannot provide security, that borders are porous, that people become obsessed with the security of their own borders. And we see really a shift from an exclusive and primary concern with conventional nation-state borders to a concern of borders being dispersed throughout society. This idea of diffusion of borders that take place in the everyday context as well as on the edges. And what this creates, of course, is a tiered society. So frontline staff who are ill-equipped and unaware of legislation are taken to be experts in immigration law, turning away people despite their full rights to access to care. And this tiered services, this tiered society then creates tiered services with different levels of access to public services. Those who don't subscribe to this idea of what constitutes as British, suffering the most. So this idea of physical and symbolic bordering is taking an increasing significance in the ordering of society. Border enforcement is being outsourced to private companies, to landlords, to employments, to public services, who are increasingly tasked to take on this role of border control. People are facing intimidation, harassment when trying to rent a flat, open a bank account, visit a doctor, go to college, go to work, at places of worship, using public transport, even walking in the street. And this monitoring affects us all, right? It really does feed into this idea of the hostile environment. But a critical bordering perspective does explore ways in which borders are created as a way to control and manage migrants in both the public and private spheres. As we've seen, it's historically grounded. Most recent legislation has introduced more bordering into everyday lives. But over decades, there has been a constant focus on maintaining surveillance. And if we trace policy, we can see checks introduced to migrant workers now being applied to people who are claiming refuge and to ordinary UK citizens. Gibney and Hansen talk about this being part of a noble lie, assuaging public opinion that means the government is seen to be doing something fueling fear and suspicion of finite resources that must be protected. And of course, we know that bordering is big business, right? There's a new technology of everyday bordering, and it's generating capital, a lot of revenue for the state through fines, landlords, haulage companies, through name and shame on Home Office websites. For example, in the restaurant industry, these are typically ethnic minority businesses. And so what that does is it introduces a racialized aspect to these kind of bordering practices. And what I'd like you to do here is pause and watch this film either before or after our class meeting. But this is a film that looked at the impact of the 2014 Immigration Act on British society. And of course, we've had the 2016 Act since. But I would like you to watch this film and think about some of these questions. How prescient was the film? How it helps us think through bordering processes and the relationship between bordering and power, and what the film tells us about certain forms of migration and the everyday context. The bordering in everyday life, we could then describe it as being uneven and differentiated, so it doesn't affect everybody in the same way. And it does depend on differing immigration statuses. It's hidden, but at the same time, paradoxically, it's extremely visible and becoming increasingly visible in different ways. It's hierarchical and boundaried. So depending on where one sits on racialized hierarchies of difference will affect how we experience borders. They're physical and they're symbolic. So we have the passport checks, we have the proof, the identity we need to provide, but they can also be symbolic in terms of how we look, the languages we speak, our names on bits of paper. And where they are both exceptional, they are increasingly becoming routine. And as much as they are remote, they're also present in the everyday context. And I'd like you to pause here and think of an example of bordering that you would be happy to share in class. This might be from your personal experience, your practice, volunteer work, general observations that you make about the world around you, or even drawing from a current event. And I'd like you to prepare just a short case study yourself, weaving in some of the literature and some of the reading that you're doing. But describe this example and reflect on ways in which this idea of bordering can help us understand these processes, and think about, is this an effective concept to think through the experiences of migration? And some of the questions that I would like us to bring to this session would be about different ways we might talk about bordering in relation to racialization, to stigma, to social segregation. Does it help us understand binaries? And in what ways might the diversification of migration covered in the course so far problematise our understanding of bordering and the usefulness of everyday bordering? What, if anything, is the relationship between bordering and everyday actions? So in this section, what we've done is we've tried to unpack some of the key ideas around bordering. And in the third short clip, we're going to be looking at bordering and, through this lens, trying to understand interactions and encounters in the everyday context.